Hello, and welcome to the Dr. Money Matters podcast, the show where we discuss important financial topics that were never covered in med school. I'm your host, Dr. Tarang Patel. In this episode of the Dr. Money Matters podcast, I'm talking about opportunity zones with my guest, Dan Gauthier, an attorney here in Scottsdale, Arizona. Opportunity zones have become a popular topic of discussion, although a recent Wall Street Journal article says that the actual uptake and investments have been a little bit slower than expected. If you're unfamiliar with opportunity zones, these are areas designated by the federal government and as areas where they would like to stimulate investment, and they do this by giving significant tax benefits. And we'll talk about these with Dan, but some of these include deferring capital gains for many years and then also reducing overall profits on the investment into the zones. So there's some significant benefits. And the government predicted a large amount of investment, over $100 billion, according to the Wall Street Journal article. They mentioned Treasury Secretary Mnuchin predicted that that's what they would actually attract. So far, it's been pretty slow, and that's partly due to delayed government guidance in these things. But we'll talk about opportunity zones with Dan. Again, I'm not recommending this as an investment, but it is something interesting to look at. And as more guidance comes about, they may be better areas to invest in. And as always, I'm not giving you specific investment advice. I'm giving you information, and this show is for education only. Please consult with your own advisors prior to making any specific investment decisions. And now, on to the podcast. Okay, welcome back to another episode of the Dr. Money Matters podcast. My guest today is Dan Gauthier, an attorney at the Rose Law Group here in Scottsdale, Arizona, and we're going to be talking about opportunity zones. Dan has written about opportunity zones. He's an expert in the field, and he's not selling anything, so that's a key thing. I wanted to get Dan on here because we talked back and forth via email. I had read an article that he'd written about opportunity zones. And I know many of the listeners to the podcast and those members in the Facebook group who are talking about real estate have been interested in opportunity zones. And so I wanted to explore what they are a little bit and then just kind of talk about the history and some of the tax benefits. So let's talk to Dan. Dan, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. It's great to be here.
So tell me a little bit just about yourself and your background, and then we'll talk about opportunity zones.
Sure, absolutely. So as you mentioned, I'm an attorney in Scottsdale, Arizona. I'm primarily a transactional attorney, so my practice is focused on real estate and business transactions, corporate transactions, both acquisition and development on the real estate side, and then I also assist businesses with raising capital and syndication to an extent. So this opportunity zone program sort of fell right in my lap, and it falls pretty nicely right into my practice. As you can imagine, and as your listeners probably are somewhat aware, this is sort of taken the tax benefit, tax incentive community by storm. So this has taken over my practice to a pretty high degree.
Right. And so, I definitely want to talk about this because, like you said, as it's involving your practice a lot, we're hearing about it a lot, and especially in this, in this era of this long-standing bull market in stocks and real estate, and then with the tax benefits that are talked about with opportunity zone investing, it's something that my listeners, most of which are high-income earners, professionals, who are trying to find tax benefits in any way they can. So let's talk a little bit about the background of an opportunity zone. When did that start, and what are opportunity zones?
Sure, yeah, that's a great place to start. So back, we'll move back about a year and a half now in time, and December 2017 was when the tax reform passed, as many of your listeners will remember. Tucked away in the back of that legislation in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was this Opportunity Zone program. It was called the Investing in Opportunity Act, and sort of fell by the wayside to some extent in the beginning. And practitioners like myself and some others, realized what it was early on, but it took a little while to catch on. Basically, what the legislation did was it authorized the Treasury Department to go out to the states and say, hey, governors of all of the states, you get to nominate census tracts in your state that qualify under these specific criteria that I can talk about. You can nominate up to 25% of your qualifying tracts and submit them to us, to Treasury, for approval. Upon approval, which I should just mention offhand that all 50 states have approved opportunity zones as of today. These census tracts were tagged, so to speak, as opportunity zones, and we can talk about what that means and how obviously investors roll money into those zones in detail in a bit. But just to move back to the qualifications, so the census tracts in general, what the tracts needed to do or to in order to be qualified was to have a poverty rate of at least 20%. And there were some other ways to qualify, but that was the big one. So you'll see that, going back to the purpose of this program, what the government was really trying to do with this legislation was incentivize long-term investment in areas of the country that don't traditionally see long-term investment. So that's why there's that poverty requirement. What we're really trying to get at here is long-term investment from sources that don't generally, that wouldn't otherwise generally invest in those areas.
Okay. And so, I don't want to get partisan or anything, but this program actually had started a while back, but it was just more clarified recently around the tax reform time. Is that correct?
Yeah. So this has been sort of, developing for a while, and it was developed in part by, there were without getting partisan either, there were advocates on both sides of the aisle. And there were advocates in the community as well. I mean, for example, the technology community, Sean Parker was a huge advocate in pushing this legislation through. And there were also, lots of, just as an example, the Economic Innovation Group, which is a nonpartisan nonprofit that pushes forward with these types of economic development programs, also had a big hand in this. So yeah, there were lots of different stakeholders, but this was, to your point, a long time coming.
Okay. So, and then you were saying, recently, the rules have kind of been clarified. So let's just kind of go over a little bit of those benefits. So, as I said, my audience is more high income professionals who are looking to be, maybe to invest in these type of opportunities. So what are the tax benefits of investing in opportunity zones?
Sure. Yeah. So to go through these, I think it's often helpful to just put some numbers to it, and I like to run with the example of a client that comes to me that has some money invested in the stock market currently and is looking to get out and seek alternative investments. So let's say that a client comes to me. He has, to keep it super simple, he has an investment in Apple stock. Okay. He's held that for a period of 10 years. It's appreciated to, let's say he purchased that 10 years ago for $10, and today it's worth, $110. So he's gained $100 on a $10 investment, right? So, the first benefit of the program is if he sells that investment and rolls it into an opportunity fund, which we can talk about in a bit, what that means. That $100 gain, which would otherwise be taxable, is deferred until the earlier of, he either sells his investment in the fund, or assuming he holds it, December 31st, 2026. So in the 2027 tax season, we have what I'm calling a phantom tax date. So even if you continue to hold your investment, so to speak, you will be taxed on that gain that you've deferred at that time. So, and just to note that $10 in the Apple stock that he originally invested, that he puts that in his pocket. That was his basis in the investment. He gets to keep that, which is a big differentiator from a 1031 transaction, which some of your listeners may be familiar with in the real estate world. So that's benefit number one, is a tax deferral, and that's a traditional one. So a tax deferral for about 7 years, assuming your investor here gets it in before the end of the year. The second benefit is assuming that investor holds his investment for 5 years. So let's say he invests today. In 2024, he receives a step up in basis on that $100 investment, which essentially is just a fancy way of saying that he's going to, when he does pay tax, pay a reduced amount. And that step up in basis is 10%. If he holds it for another 2 years, so 7 years total, he receives another step up in basis of 5%. So running with my example, he invests today in 2019. At the end of 2026, he has held his investment for 7 years. In early 2027, he's going to pay taxes on $85, not $100, because he has that 15% step up in basis, right? So that's benefit number two, is that step up in basis. Benefit number three is likely the one that your listeners have heard about, and it's the big kahuna, so to speak. Benefit three is that $100 investment, if held for 10 years. Let's say the investment is in a mixed-use development, a real estate development in the greater Phoenix area. So I'll use something I'm familiar with. After 10 years, that $100 investment is now worth $200. It has doubled in value over 10 years. When the investor goes and sells that, the $100 gain is tax-free. So that is the big catch on this program, is any appreciation on your initial investment that's held for 10 years, the tax is forgiven on that amount.
Okay. All right. So now you're getting my listeners very excited about this, because you talked about three different things. Obviously, the original $10 that you invested in Apple is not taxed because that was your original basis. Number two, if you hold it for 7 years, you get a discount of 15% on the gain from the 10 to the 100, right?
That's right. Yep.
And then third, and like you said, it's any appreciation once you put the 100 in, if it goes to 150, 200, whatever, is tax free if you hold it for the 7 years.
Hold it for the 10 years. 10 years.
Oh, 10 years. Okay, 10 years. So if you were putting it in now, by the end of this year, 10 years would be the end of 2029, basically.
Correct. Yeah. So from a timing perspective, what your listeners will need to keep in mind is that at the end of 2026, no matter what happens, if assuming they participate in this program, they're going to have a tax bill due, and the amount of which will depend on when they invest in the fund. It's whether they can get that 5-year vesting or 7-year vesting that will determine what discount they'll pay on those taxes.
Gotcha. Okay. So. And you said basically, there are opportunity zones in all 50 states. How and we talk about funds, and I'm sure some of my listeners are aware that there are crowdfunding platforms that are doing opportunity zones. There are private REITs doing opportunity zone investing. Is it something that you would need to get the assets to the fund by the end of the year, or the fund has to make all of its investments by the end of the year?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So the 5 and 7 year vesting is all on the investor side. So all of the timetables we've talked about so far have to do just with the investor rolling that money in. So the critical date is the dollars need to hit the bank account of the fund or change hands, for legally speaking at least, by the end of this year. The fund has different timing requirements and does not need to deploy by the end of the year.
Okay. And then we had talked a little bit offline when we were talking before the interview about, like I said, most of the listeners would think of investing in funds, but you don't actually have to invest in a fund to do this. You can actually invest in real estate or business or something in the opportunity zone yourself. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct. And I use the word fund throughout because that's the way it's termed in the law. What we're really talking about here, and we can break this down as to be as simple or make it as complicated as we want. But the simple way of looking at this is the fund, quote unquote, is just a legal entity. So, I have clients coming to me now that have specific real estate or business projects in mind. And they're saying, look, I either have capital gains myself or I know people that do. I'm not interested in going to an institutional fund. What I'm interested in doing is simply forming a business and rolling those capital gains in and investing in whether it's an existing piece of property or it's a piece of raw land that they want to develop. That's all possible. So there are some specific requirements that the fund, the entity needs to comply with. But just as far as options for investors, absolutely. You can choose to go your own route with your own project. Or you can choose to go to one of the many existing funds out there, the crowdfunding platforms that you referenced.
Right. Okay. And so I guess the question then becomes, if I wanted to do it myself, instead of going to what would the steps, in a kind of global overview, because this is something that you would help people set up if they wanted to, but what would just kind of be general steps that you would need to take? Like, how would you have to register it as an opportunity zone fund or something like that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And now that we're getting back, down into the facts, I probably should have done this at the beginning of the podcast, but just qualify what I say as, don't take legal advice from the podcast.
Yes, absolutely. So, or financial advice, just broad themes.
Yes, exactly. So, I'm happy to talk about specifics, but, just to get that, lawyerly thing out of the way, of course.
Absolutely.
No, but so, going to your question, if someone wanted to do this themselves, they would go and form an LLC or another legal entity. The way that I've done it so far is generally as an LLC or a limited partnership, depending on where the money's coming from. And they would essentially roll that money in under the guidance, the timelines required in the program. And as far as certifying, the law provides for a completely self-certified type program. So it's similar to filing your taxes, right? So filing your taxes is on the individual. Really, the issues arise if the IRS comes to you and says, we're going to audit you, right? It's really the same type of process. So from an investor perspective, you will file an additional form on your annual taxes. And from the fund perspective, the fund has testing dates, we call them, but they're essentially dates where they just have to submit a form to the IRS, and those dates are twice a year. So every 6 months, the fund would need to submit a form to the IRS and the Treasury Department stating that they are in compliance with the program.
I think one of the confusing things was that initially, most people thought of this as a real estate only type of play, and I think that's the predominant idea still. But there is something where you can actually create a business in an opportunity zone too, right? It's not just you have to build a housing or an office space or something like that. That you can actually create businesses in opportunity zones and still take advantage of the tax benefits. Is that correct?
That's absolutely correct. Yeah. So the rules as written, the law as written applies to both real estate, so real property, and businesses, whether new or existing. So we've talked a lot about the law in general. There's been some guidance that has come out over the past year and a half or so, and that has clarified what an investment in a business will look like. I don't want to understate it. An investment in a business will likely always be more complicated and carry more than an investment in real estate, just because there are more moving parts. So, just to give you an overview, the program requires that a certain amount of property owned by the fund entity is what we would call quote unquote qualified opportunity zone property, which essentially means that it's property that's used within an opportunity zone. The problem, or not the problem, but the complication that arises with businesses is just as I said, there are moving parts. People work in different places. Property moves. It's not as simple and straightforward as I would consider real estate to be. So my recommendation is, any of your listeners that are looking to invest in a new or existing business, and that business can even be related to their own. Absolutely seek out professionals to help you navigate some of the landmines that are built into this law. So it definitely with real estate as well, but just flagging that in particular with investing in businesses.
I think unlike what we talked to a lot of the guests on the podcast in terms of market investing and buying broad-based index ETFs, where it is relatively straightforward to do it yourself. In this type of situation where there are certain legal questions and always changing guidelines, things like that. Yeah, I definitely agree there. Get professional help, because it's much cheaper to do that and more time effective to do that now as opposed to dealing with the consequences later. Just like you said about getting audited later, it's much easier to comply early rather than dealing with the IRS consequences later. Let's talk a little bit about, so you said that the opportunity zones are pretty much, in all 50 states, they're geared towards lower income areas. Are there pitfalls to look out for when you're looking to invest? And again, you're not, endorsing any particular fund or anything like that, but, we're going to be bombarded with this as high income accredited investors. Any suggestions that you would have about what to look out for when being solicited these opportunities?
Yeah, absolutely. So we can kind of take this in two buckets. So the first bucket is, an investor, one of your listeners that is looking at the crowdfunding type platform or the solicitation for accredited investors, as you put it. We are seeing a lot of these types of funds pop up. There will be a lot more once we see Wall Street and the full-fledged institutional side come in. We really haven't seen that yet. We haven't seen those dollars start pouring in yet. We anticipate in the next couple of months over the summer, that's really when you'll see a lot more. But even for the funds that are existing, I've worked with some investor clients on essentially doing due diligence on a fund investment, similar to what you would do if you were looking at another syndicated deal, for your listeners that have been involved in those types of deals in the past. So things you'll want to look at are fees, of course, that the fund is taking. A lot of funds in this space are taking not necessarily elevated management fees, but elevated interest in the either the equity of the fund itself or the interest in the profits on the back end. I would just recommend, looking through those private placement memorandums, to use that, as your listeners may be familiar with that term, and other offering documents. Be careful and read those thoroughly. Know that, I can tell you that from my experience in this space, I wouldn't call them onerous, but funds know that this is there's more money on the table in this space. We'll just put it like that. So there's more money to be made, which means some people count their money and count other people's money. So that's one bucket. The other bucket is for your listeners that are looking at going out and doing this themselves, or with a partner, or pseudo themselves, so to speak. In that bucket, I'd just say that not all opportunity zones are created equal. I explained earlier how zones were qualified by the governors of each state, but what I will say is that the census tracts were necessarily pulled from the 2010 census. So this is, it's every 10 years that the census occurs. So that's the last thing we had to move on. And I would say that, a lot has changed in 9 years. For example, where I'm sitting in Old Town Scottsdale is an opportunity zone, which, for those of your listeners that are familiar at all with this area, they'd say, what? That is not a 20% poverty area. There are a lot of sort of head shaking zones across Arizona and across the country. So we have, I think 4 of the 5 major downtown areas of the cities in the Phoenix metro area are opportunity zones. That is not unique to Arizona. If you look at other states, their major cities, those downtown areas and those ancillary neighborhoods that are booming right now are opportunity zones. So I would tell your listeners that, you can absolutely look at zones across the country, regardless of where you live. You can absolutely look at zones across the country, regardless of where your entity, your fund, is incorporated. It does not matter whatsoever. So keep that in mind when you're looking, and don't necessarily settle for a zone that has a project that isn't necessarily as appetizing as you'd like it to be.
Okay. That's really good advice. I like that. So let's get back a little bit to that, because like you said, you're in Old Town Scottsdale, which if you aren't familiar, is a very up and coming entertainment, party, office space area. A lot of younger people are moving to that area for tech jobs, things like that. So definitely not what one would picture, like you said, in the 20% poverty area. But the question is, will they then, because we're coming up on a census here next year, would these things be potentially reclassified? Are there going to be new opportunity zones added subsequently?
So the answer is the lawyer one that you'll hate is it depends. What I can say is that it's very unlikely that there would be any sort of reclassification under this round of the program. You can sort of think of this initial 10-year period or initial round as a test case. I've been talking to fund principals and developers about this, and what they're saying is we want this program to continue. We've heard murmurings about this being something that the Treasury Department would continue on if we can show that it's working. So, to go back to your question, it is extremely unlikely that the designation for zones would change at the 2020 census, because, think about what that would mean. That would mean that all investments into zones, unless they were grandfathered in, would be subject to change, would be subject to disqualification, again, unless they were grandfathered in. It is possible that in the future, there may be redesignation under this, couched under this same program or a sister program. For example, we saw back, when we were in hurricane season, I think it was this past year, we saw some legislation at the federal level looking to classify additional emergency opportunity zones across the country. So, in other words, new zones that would qualify specifically for the purpose of helping those that were affected by weather tragedies, acts of God across the country. So, it's possible we'll see something like that, but to answer your original question, it's very unlikely. We're sort of stuck with what we have for now.
Right. And that makes sense. I mean, it would be very difficult to change those kind of laws once they've put into place. But you could, you're right, grandfathering in and maybe, who knows, if it works, potentially new areas could be designated as well. One of the things that you reminded me when you were talking about the weather was I believe we talked about the 50 states. I believe most of Puerto Rico, which sometimes people forget, is also designated an opportunity zone. So I don't want to not include that because it's also qualified. Now, not all of it, and don't take my word, look at it, but I believe I read that recently where almost the entire island of Puerto Rico is designated.
It's a large majority of the island is entirely an opportunity zone. Yeah. And I should also mention that for your listeners that are interested in finding out what is and is not an opportunity zone, if they're looking at specific areas in particular, if they're in Arizona, they can go to the Arizona Commerce Authority website that has a great map where you can sort of zoom in and look at down to property lines, whether it's in or outside of a zone. And other states, and frankly, every other state that I've looked at will have a similar type map on their economic development site or Commerce Authority type site. So absolutely look it up, and any of your listeners that are curious as to specific areas, they can absolutely reach out to me, and I can point them in the right direction as well.
Sure, and I'll put a link up to the Arizona website for that. But my one question that I have is, we were talking about where you're located, being in an opportunity zone. Are you seeing that, properties, because I think I've seen that properties are marketed now, as opportunity zone or not. If they have it, obviously it's a positive thing for their selling price. Are you seeing that those prices have actually increased by any chance, just because they are located in opportunity zones?
Yeah. So from a national perspective, I was reading an article a week or two ago, and it was based on some data that had come out recently that looked at prices in opportunity zones versus those not in opportunity zones, and that article claimed a 20% increase in property prices inside a zone, which is fairly substantial. I was talking to an economic development coordinator in one of the counties here in Arizona a couple of weeks ago as well. I shared that 20% number with him, and his face lit up because he told me that they've seen much greater appreciation, multitudes higher than 20%. He wasn't willing to share a number with me, but you can think multitudes higher of 20%. I'm thinking 40 or 50% increase.
Wow. Okay. So that's, something to look out for as well before you jump in, because like we said, I've said this before on the podcast, while the tax benefits are great and, this seems like a really good program, just be aware that there may be some additional markup that you're paying up front in order to realize that. So again, as I've said with any other investment, and we have a lawyer on today who can agree with this, do your own due diligence, make sure that these are good investments and something that you would invest in potentially anyway. Don't just let the opportunity zone part of it dictate your investment.
That's a fantastic point. I'll just add that the way we've been looking at this is this program does not make a bad deal good. It will move the needle enough in some cases to make a good deal great or even fantastic. But in very few cases will I look at a deal and say, this wouldn't have worked before the program, but now it looks great, right? So, absolutely, you're absolutely correct to your due diligence, and I'll add one other point as well, that any of your listeners that currently own property, check out whether it's in an opportunity zone. If you are at all interested in offloading all or a portion of that, that you could potentially take advantage of that appreciation I was just talking about.
Right. That's a really good point, because a lot of them may not know about that. And, I'm sure there are existing property owners, especially individual property owners, as opposed to the corporate entities, that may not be aware of what they're actually sitting on. So that's a really good point about that. Dan, I want to thank you for coming on the podcast. Anything that you feel like my listeners should know that we haven't touched upon?
We talked broadly about how the law was enacted last year, and some guidance has come out. I'll just touch on timeline for moving forward within the program. So we had that initial law on December 17. We had a couple of rounds of guidance, the first in October 2018, and then the second in April of this year, 2019. We are not sure yet. Treasury has not come out and said whether there will be yet another, a third round of guidance before we have in tax world what we'll call final regulations. So I do want to flag that everything we've said today is based upon the law, but the way tax law works is it's ever changing. We have regulations that are put out all the time, and keep that in mind when you are looking at deals. I know that most of my clients in this area are comfortable enough with the program to deploy capital and get going, start moving dirt, so to speak. But just be aware that there is potential that we may see a third round of regulations, which may further clarify or move the needle, to use that phrase again, on the implementation of this program.
Okay, good. That's good to know. Like you said, things are always changing, but at this point, we're kind of telling you what we know to this point, and one of the key things to remember is that to get the full tax benefits, as it's written now, you want to have the money in the account by the end of the year.
That's absolutely correct. Yeah, to get that 15% step up in basis that we talked about earlier, that trigger point is the end of 2019. That's correct.
Good. Now, tell my listeners where they can find out more about you, and then some of the articles that you've written, and we'll link to that in the show notes.
Yeah, absolutely. So you can click on the link that will be in the show notes, which will take you to my biography. I work for a firm called Rose Law Group here in Scottsdale. On my bio, you will see thumbnails for a number of articles. Lots of articles on this topic that I've either written or commented on. I update that regularly. My contact information will also appear on my bio. So any additional questions, absolutely feel free to shoot me an email or give me a call. I'm happy to help out.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Dan. Appreciate you coming on. This is definitely a topic that we wanted to touch on, and I know many of the listeners are just kind of aware of it, but they wanted to get a little more detail, and I thank you for providing that. And I encourage anyone who's listening to contact Dan if they have any more specific questions, or send me an email. I can forward it on to Dan, and then we as more clarification comes about, changes come about, maybe we'll have you back on in the podcast to kind of update.
That sounds great. Thanks so much for having me, and hope this was beneficial for your listeners, and look forward to speaking with you again potentially soon.
I hope this episode was educational. I want to thank Dan for coming on the show and explaining more information about opportunity zones. I know there's a little bit of a discussion going on now because we're at the year end and people are looking for ways to improve their tax situations. But remember, don't invest in something just because it's in an opportunity zone. If you have an investment that makes sense, an opportunity zone characterization can make it better, but that shouldn't be the primary reason you invest in the opportunity. There are several people who I've talked to and other people around the country whose groups have been recently, whose medical groups have been purchased by private equity or hospitals and have come into a fair amount of income recently. They may have some more interest in looking into this as a way to defer capital gains. But again, make sure whatever investment you're choosing makes sense on its own merit, and then an opportunity zone can help tilt it in its favor. If you have more questions about opportunity zones or would like to interact with Dan directly, I'll put the contact information and the show notes, but also perhaps we could do a Facebook Live or a webinar with Dan. So if you want, please indicate so at the Dr. Money Matters Facebook group, or send me a message via Twitter or email, and you'll get that information on the show notes. Thanks for joining us on another episode of Dr. Money Matters. If this is the first episode you have heard, I appreciate you taking the time out and listening, and encourage you to listen to our past episodes. I would also appreciate you leaving me a positive review on Apple Podcasts, and also recommend you join our Facebook group where we have ongoing discussions about this and other topics in order to help each other reach our financial goals. Finally, I encourage you to subscribe to our email list and also to subscribe to the podcast itself on the various podcast app that you use in order to be kept aware when the latest episode comes out. More episodes of this podcast are available at www.drmoneymatters.com and on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. Audio versions are also available on YouTube and Facebook. And you can follow me on Twitter at drmoneymatters or on Facebook or Instagram at Dr. Money Matters, all spelled out. Thanks for listening, and if you get a chance, please leave a positive review for this podcast, as it helps move the podcast up the rankings on iTunes and gets it exposed to a wider audience. Thanks for listening once again, and stay tuned for another episode coming soon.